October 19th, 1944, somewhere over the scarred industrial heart of Germany, Oberleutnant Franz Stigler pushed his Messerschmitt Bf 109 to its absolute limit, trying desperately to shake the massive American fighter locked onto his tail. He pulled into a climb that should have left any Allied fighter wallowing behind him. Instead, the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt matched his ascent degree for degree, closing the distance with terrifying precision. In that moment, as tracer rounds began streaking past his canopy, Stigler understood something that would haunt German pilots for the remainder of the war. They had underestimated the Americans, and they had underestimated this particular fighter most of all. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The story of why the Thunderbolt became the most feared American fighter in German skies is not one of immediate superiority or revolutionary design. It is a story of transformation, of learning from blood and failure, of an aircraft that began its combat career as something of a disappointment and evolved into a weapon that fundamentally altered the balance of air power over Europe. To understand this fear, we must first understand what the P-47 represented when it arrived in England during late 1942 and early 1943. The fighter was massive by any standard of the era, weighing more than 7 tons fully loaded. British pilots, seeing it for the first time, nicknamed it the Jug for its resemblance to a milk jug, wide and heavy in the fuselage. American pilots adopted the name, though not always affectionately. The aircraft seemed to contradict everything pilots had learned about fighter design. Fighters were supposed to be nimble, light, and quick to respond. The Thunderbolt was none of these things. Yet, Republic Aviation had designed the P-47 around a specific philosophy that would prove prophetic, even if initially controversial. Chief designer Alexander Kartveli believed that future air combat would occur at high altitudes where bomber formations flew, and that fighters would need to be fast, heavily armed, and capable of absorbing tremendous battle damage. He designed the Thunderbolt around the most powerful engine available, the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, producing 2,000 horsepower. He gave it 8 50 caliber machine guns, more firepower than any contemporary fighter. He surrounded the pilot with armor plating and protected vital systems with redundant components. The result was an aircraft that weighed twice as much as a Spitfire and looked more like a small bomber than a fighter. When the first Thunderbolt groups arrived in England and began flying combat missions in spring 1943, German pilots initially regarded them with curiosity rather than concern. The Luftwaffe had faced and defeated numerous Allied fighter types. They had learned the strengths and weaknesses of Spitfires, Hurricanes, and the early American fighters like the P-38 Lightning and P-39 Airacobra. Each Allied fighter type had characteristics German pilots could exploit. The early combat reports on the Thunderbolt seemed to confirm that this new American fighter would be no different. Luftwaffe pilots discovered the P-47 was fast in a dive, faster than almost any German fighter, but it climbed poorly and turned sluggishly. Standard German tactics of the period emphasized energy fighting, using superior climb performance to gain altitude advantage, then diving through enemy formations at high speed. If Allied fighters pursued, German pilots would pull into steep climbs that most Allied fighters could not match, escaping to altitude where they could reset the engagement on their terms. These tactics worked perfectly against early Thunderbolts. 4 190 pilots and Bf 109 pilots found they could engage Thunderbolts, fire a burst, then climb away before the heavy American fighters could bring their superior firepower to bear. Major Gunther Rahl, flying with Jagdgeschwader 11, later recalled that in spring and summer 1943, engaging Thunderbolts was considered relatively safe compared to tangling with Spitfires. The P-47 was dangerous if you gave it opportunities, but disciplined German pilots could control the engagement, attacking on their terms and disengaging when circumstances turned unfavorable. This German confidence, this sense that they understood and could manage the Thunderbolt threat, would prove to be a catastrophic miscalculation. What German intelligence failed to fully appreciate was that American industrial and engineering culture approached problems differently than their German counterparts. When, American pilots reported that enemy fighters were escaping by outclimbing them. The response was not to accept this as an inherent limitation of the aircraft design, but to identify the specific technical problem causing the deficiency and fix it. The narrow-blade propellers fitted to early production Thunderbolts were optimized for high-speed cruise efficiency, but could not efficiently convert the R2800's massive power output into vertical performance. American engineers recognized this, designed wider paddle blade propellers that dramatically improved thrust at low speeds, manufactured them in quantities exceeding 10,000 units, and deployed them to operational squadrons in England within 9 months of identifying the problem. This was not revolutionary technology. It was methodical problem-solving executed at industrial scale with remarkable speed. The transformation began reaching operational units in late December 1943 and early January 1944. The 56th Fighter Group, flying from Boxted in Essex, completed their transition to paddle blade-equipped Thunderbolts. By early January, other groups followed through January and February. German pilots began noticing something was different during late January engagements, but the full implications did not become clear until March. The combat on March 6, 1944 over Berlin, when the 56th Fighter Group destroyed 11 German fighters without loss, while chasing them through climbing engagements that should have been impossible, marked a turning point. German intelligence examined gun camera footage showing standard P-47 Thunderbolts achieving performance that contradicted everything they understood about the aircraft. The modification to the propeller seemed too simple to account for such dramatic improvement, yet the evidence was undeniable. Thunderbolts were now matching German fighters in vertical combat, eliminating the primary escape route Luftwaffe pilots had relied upon. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. What made this transformation particularly devastating was its timing. By early 1944, the Luftwaffe was already under severe strain from multiple fronts. German fighter forces were defending against American daylight bombing raids in the west and Soviet advances in the east, while trying to maintain presence in the Mediterranean and other theaters. Pilot training programs were shortened due to fuel shortages. Experienced pilots were being ground down through attrition. German aircraft production, while impressive in absolute numbers, was not keeping pace with losses. Into this already stressed system came the revelation that one of the primary tactical advantages, German pilots held superior climb performance, allowing them to control engagement. Parameters had been neutralized through an American modification that seemed almost insultingly simple. The psychological impact on German pilots cannot be overstated. Imagine training for months or years to fly a high-performance fighter aircraft, learning tactics that had proven successful, surviving early combat missions, beginning to feel some confidence in your skills and your machine, only to discover that the enemy has changed the rules of the game. The Focke-Wulf FTW-190 had been designed specifically to outperform Allied fighters in most flight regimes. It was faster than Spitfires at low and medium altitudes, climbed better than Thunderbolts, and had heavier armament than most Allied fighters. 190 pilots had legitimate reasons to feel confident in their aircraft's capabilities. Then, over the course of a few weeks in early 1944, they discovered that American Thunderbolts could now match their climbing performance, could stay with them through vertical maneuvers, and brought overwhelming firepower to bear with 8 50-caliber machine guns. German pilots adapted their tactics, attempting to avoid vertical combat and engage only when holding energy advantages. But changing ingrained combat behavior is extraordinarily difficult, especially under the stress of combat. Pilots who had survived for months or years by climbing away from danger found those survival instincts could now get them killed. The Thunderbolt's transformation exposed them in situations where they should have been safe. Major Heinz Baer, one of Germany's highest-scoring aces with 220 victories, later described the improved Thunderbolt as fundamentally more dangerous than the P-51 Mustang in certain tactical situations. The Mustang was faster and more maneuverable, but the Thunderbolt's combination of speed, firepower, and now improved vertical performance made it exceptionally lethal in the bomber escort role. Thunderbolt pilots could engage German fighters, attacking bomber formations, drive them off, then climb back to escort altitude without losing position. "The Mustang might kill you in a turning fight," Baer noted, "but the Thunderbolt would kill you when you thought you were escaping." This was a different kind of fear. The fear that comes not from facing a superior opponent, but from realizing that advantages you counted on no longer exist. German fighter tactics throughout 1943 had been built around certain assumptions about Allied fighter capabilities. American and British fighters were dangerous in horizontal combat and diving attacks, but could generally be escaped through climbing disengagement. These assumptions shaped everything from individual pilot behavior to squadron-level tactics to strategic decisions about how to defend against bomber raids. The improved Thunderbolt invalidated these assumptions overnight. The fear German pilots developed toward the P-47 was also compounded by other characteristics of the aircraft that became more apparent as combat intensified. The Thunderbolt was extraordinarily durable. Its air-cooled radial engine could absorb damage that would destroy the liquid-cooled inline engines used in German fighters. Multiple German pilots reported instances of hitting Thunderbolts with cannon fire that should have been lethal, only to watch the American fighter continue flying. Lieutenant Walter Schuck, flying with Jagdgeschwader 5, recalled engaging a Thunderbolt that absorbed multiple 20mm cannon hits in the fuselage and wings. He broke off, certain the aircraft was finished, only to see it continue flying straight and level, apparently undamaged. Schuck later learned that particular Thunderbolt returned to base safely. Such experiences were deeply demoralizing. German pilots were fighting in aircraft with lighter structures and vulnerable cooling systems. A single 50 caliber round through the cooling system of a Bf-109 or FEW-190 could force the pilot to bail out within minutes as the engine seized. Yet Thunderbolts seemed able to absorb battle damage that would destroy German fighters and continue fighting. The firepower disparity was equally significant. German fighters typically carried 2 or 3 machine guns plus 1 or 2 cannon. The cannon packed tremendous destructive power, but carried limited ammunition, typically enough for 3 to 5 seconds of firing. Pilots had to close to very short range and make every burst count. The Thunderbolt carried 8 50 caliber machine guns with substantial ammunition loads, typically 400 rounds per gun. This gave Thunderbolt pilots the ability to fire extended bursts from longer range, walking their fire onto targets. They did not need to be as precise as German pilots because they could simply put more rounds in the air. For German pilots, this meant that once a Thunderbolt achieved firing position, escaping became extremely difficult. The long reach of 8 50 caliber guns meant the American pilot could start firing from ranges where German return fire was ineffective, and the sustained rate of fire meant that even if the first burst missed, the second or third likely would not. Josef Priller, a Luftwaffe ace with 101 victories who commanded Jagdgeschwader 26, wrote in his combat reports that engaging improved Thunderbolts required perfect execution. Any mistake, any momentary loss of situational awareness, any failed maneuver, and the Thunderbolt's overwhelming firepower would finish you. The fear was not of a quick death, but of the knowledge that fighting Thunderbolts offered very narrow margins for error. German fighter pilots in 1944 were already operating under tremendous stress. They were outnumbered, often by factors of 3 or 4 to 1. They were flying multiple sorties per day, defending against bomber streams that arrived with numbing regularity. They were watching friends die, watching the Luftwaffe's strength erode despite their best efforts. Into this environment came the knowledge that one of the most numerous American fighter types had evolved into something far more capable than they had faced before. The psychological burden this added to already exhausted pilots was immense. When you are outnumbered and outproduced, small advantages matter enormously. If you know your aircraft climbs better than the enemy, you can use that advantage to survive, to reset engagements on favorable terms, to escape when things go wrong. Take that advantage away, and suddenly survival becomes much more difficult. The transformation of the Thunderbolt also highlighted the brutal reality of industrial warfare. Germany's aircraft industry was producing impressive numbers of fighters throughout 1944, but production was focused on maintaining quantities of existing designs. Introducing modifications comparable to the American paddle blade propeller would require retooling production lines, testing, certification, updating maintenance procedures, and training. All of this would reduce output at a time when every aircraft mattered desperately. American industry, operating far from combat zones with abundant resources and no production disruptions from bombing, could implement improvements rapidly without sacrificing production volume. German pilots were fighting in aircraft that represented the best their industry could produce under circumstances of increasing scarcity and disruption, while facing American aircraft that kept getting better. This technological stagnation on the German side versus continuous improvement on the American side meant that the gap in capability widened over time. In early 1943, German fighters held tangible advantages over Thunderbolts in most performance categories. By mid-1944, those advantages had largely evaporated. The fear German pilots felt toward the P-47 was also a fear of what the aircraft represented. It was a symbol of American industrial might, of an enemy that could identify problems and solve them faster than Germany could develop responses. It was a reminder that no matter how skilled German pilots were, no matter how bravely they fought, they were fighting against an enemy with effectively unlimited resources. Every Thunderbolt shot down was replaced within days. Every pilot lost represented months of training that Germany could barely afford. The improved Thunderbolt, appearing in greater numbers with each passing month, was physical evidence that Germany was losing the technological and industrial race that would ultimately decide the war. German intelligence reports from mid-1944 forward consistently identified the P-47 as one of the most dangerous Allied fighter types, not because it had superior performance to the P-51 Mustang in most categories, but because of how it combined multiple threatening characteristics. It was fast enough to catch German fighters in most situations, rugged enough to survive damage that would destroy other aircraft, heavily armed enough to kill with brief firing opportunities, and now capable enough vertically to contest German fighters in three-dimensional combat. The tactical flexibility this gave Thunderbolt pilots was extraordinary. They could escort bombers at high altitude, dive to low altitude to strafe ground targets, climb back to altitude to resume escort duties, and engage German fighters effectively throughout the entire altitude range. No other Allied fighter matched this versatility. The Mustang was superior in some roles, the Spitfire in others, but the Thunderbolt could do nearly everything reasonably well, and some things like absorbing battle damage and delivering sustained firepower better than any contemporary fighter. For German pilots tasked with defending against bomber streams and their escorts, the Thunderbolt was the opponent they least wanted to face. It would not give them opportunities to exploit. It would not break off when damaged unless catastrophically hit. Its pilots, increasingly confident in their aircraft's capabilities, pressed attacks aggressively. The combination of machine and pilot attitude made the Thunderbolt uniquely dangerous. Major Gerhard Barkhorn, with 301 victories, the second highest scoring ace in history, stated in post-war interviews that while he personally feared the Yak-3 and La-7 on the Eastern Front for their maneuverability, on the rare occasions he flew in the West, he feared the Thunderbolt most because it was simply relentless. It would chase you, it would take hits and keep fighting, and if it got behind you, escaping required perfect execution plus substantial luck. The evolution of American pilot training contributed significantly to German fears about the Thunderbolt. By mid-1944, American replacement pilots arriving in England had received comprehensive training in the United States, typically accumulating 200 to 300 hours of flight time before entering combat. They had practiced gunnery extensively, learned formation flying, and studied German tactics from reports compiled by intelligence officers who debriefed returning pilots after every mission. German replacement pilots in the same period often arrived at frontline units with fewer than 100 hours total flight time, minimal gunnery training, and almost no instruction in formation tactics. The disparity was crushing. A novice German pilot in a technologically capable aircraft faced experienced American pilots in increasingly capable Thunderbolts, and the outcome was grimly predictable. Luftwaffe unit commanders filed increasingly desperate reports throughout summer and fall 1944, noting that new pilots were being shot down on their first or second missions, often before they could even engage the enemy effectively. The Americans were not just winning through numbers and industrial capacity. They were winning because they could afford to train their pilots properly, while Germany could not. This training differential meant that Thunderbolt capabilities were being exploited by pilots who understood how to use them. Colonel Hubert Zemke, commanding the 56th Fighter Group, was a methodical tactician who studied combat reports obsessively, looking for patterns and opportunities. When his group received paddle blade-equipped Thunderbolts in early January 1944, Zemke immediately recognized the tactical implications and organized intensive training to develop techniques that exploited the improved climbing performance. He taught his pilots to engage German fighters in climbing spirals, maneuvers that would have been suicidal with earlier Thunderbolts but were now viable offensive tactics. He developed the concept of vertical scissors, where two Thunderbolts would work together, one climbing to force a German fighter to climb defensively, while the second positioned for a diving attack once the German aircraft lost energy. These were sophisticated tactics that required coordination, situational awareness, and confidence in the aircraft's capabilities. German pilots facing such coordinated attacks found themselves overwhelmed. The disciplined teamwork of American fighter units, combined with the Thunderbolt's enhanced performance, created tactical situations where German pilots had no good options. Major Francis Gabreski exemplified the kind of pilot who made the Thunderbolt truly feared. Gabreski was methodical and patient, characteristics that served him extraordinarily well in the cockpit of a fighter aircraft. He did not chase every opportunity or take unnecessary risks. Instead, he positioned carefully, waited for the right moment, then struck with overwhelming violence. Flying paddle blade-equipped Thunderbolts, Gabreski developed the climbing spiral technique into a devastatingly effective tactic. He would engage a German fighter at equal altitude, typically around 24,000 feet. Rather than attempting to turn with the more maneuverable German aircraft horizontally, he would maintain speed and pull into a climbing turn. German pilots, seeing the Thunderbolt climb, often followed, expecting the heavy American fighter to lose energy and become vulnerable. But Gabreski's Thunderbolt maintained climb rate even while turning. He would spiral upward through 2 or 3 complete circles, gradually bleeding the German fighter's energy until the enemy pilot had no choice but to break off or stall. At that moment, with the German fighter at low speed and high altitude with nowhere to go, Gabreski would reverse, dive onto the target, and open fire from a position where escape was impossible. He claimed 28 aerial victories using these methods, making him the highest-scoring American ace in Europe flying a single aircraft type. Nearly all those victories came after his squadron transitioned to paddle blade propellers. German pilots who survived encounters with Gabreski described him as terrifying, not because he was reckless, but because he was precise. He never gave them opportunities, never made mistakes they could exploit, and used his aircraft's capabilities with surgical exactness. The Thunderbolt's role in ground attack missions added another dimension to German fears. While the fighter had been designed for high-altitude bomber escort, its rugged construction and powerful engine made it exceptionally capable in the low-altitude strike role. By summer 1944, Thunderbolt groups were conducting extensive fighter-bomber operations, attacking German rail lines, truck convoys, tanks, and airfields. The paddle blade propellers, which had been developed to improve high-altitude combat performance, proved equally valuable in ground attack work. Improved thrust at low speeds allowed heavily loaded Thunderbolts carrying bombs or rockets to maintain speed and maneuverability even close to the ground. Pilots could enter attack dives from lower altitudes, reducing exposure time to anti-aircraft fire, then climb away rapidly after delivering ordnance. German ground forces learned to fear the distinctive sound of the R2800 engine. When Thunderbolts appeared overhead, German troops knew devastation would follow. The 850 caliber machine guns could shred soft vehicles and suppress anti-aircraft positions. 5-inch rockets could penetrate tank armor. 1,000-pound bombs could destroy bridges and rail junctions. The Thunderbolt could deliver all these weapons with reasonable accuracy, then defend itself against any German fighters that attempted to interfere. Oberfeldwebel Otto Kohler, who served with a German panzer regiment in France during summer 1944, later described the psychological impact of constant Thunderbolt attacks. His unit would attempt to move during daylight hours, knowing they were vulnerable but having no choice because nighttime movement alone was insufficient to meet operational requirements. Within minutes of beginning any daylight movement, Allied fighters would appear. Usually they were Thunderbolts, identifiable by their distinctive shape and the deep roar of their engines. The fighters would circle briefly, assessing the target, then roll into their attack dives. Kohler recalled the helplessness of sitting in a tank, knowing that armor which could withstand anti-tank rounds was useless against air attack. The Thunderbolts would make multiple passes, methodically destroying vehicles one by one, and German anti-aircraft fire seemed to have no effect. Even when hits were observed, the American fighters continued attacking. Kohler's regiment lost 60% of its vehicles to air attack before ever engaging Allied ground forces. The survivors were demoralized and exhausted, having spent days under constant threat from above. This was what the Thunderbolt represented to German ground forces, an unstoppable instrument of destruction that they could neither evade nor effectively fight back against. The strategic implications of Thunderbolt operations extended far beyond individual combat encounters. By achieving and maintaining air superiority over Western Europe, American and British air forces created conditions that made German military operations increasingly difficult and ultimately impossible. The Thunderbolt, as one of the primary tools for achieving this air superiority, contributed directly to the success of the D-Day invasion and subsequent Allied advance across France and into Germany. During the preparatory phase before the Normandy invasion, Thunderbolt groups conducted intensive operations aimed at destroying the Luftwaffe's capability to interfere with the landings. Fighter sweeps ranged across northern France, attacking German airfields, destroying aircraft on the ground, and engaging any German fighters that attempted to respond. The improved Thunderbolts proved exceptionally effective in these operations. When German fighters scrambled to intercept, they typically had to climb from lower altitudes to reach American fighters operating at 20,000 feet or higher. Thunderbolts could dive on these climbing German fighters, attack with overwhelming firepower, then climb away before effective retaliation was possible. The result was devastating German fighter losses with minimal American casualties. By June 6, 1944, the Luftwaffe was so depleted and demoralized that it managed fewer than 100 sorties over the invasion beaches during the critical first 24 hours, while Allied air forces flew more than 8,700 sorties during the same period. German fighter pilots who did attempt to interfere with the invasion were systematically destroyed by Thunderbolts and other Allied fighters maintaining air superiority. The few German pilots who survived to return to base filed reports describing impossible odds, skies filled with American fighters, and no reasonable chance of accomplishing their missions. This was the ultimate expression of what the Thunderbolt had become, not just a dangerous opponent in individual combat, but a crucial component of a system that had achieved total air dominance. The statistical evidence of the Thunderbolt's impact is compelling when examined over time. In the first quarter of 1944, before paddle blade propellers became widespread, American fighters in Europe achieved an overall kill ratio of approximately 1.8 to 1 against German fighters. By the second quarter of 1944, with most American fighters equipped with paddle blades, the kill ratio improved to 3.2 to 1. By the third quarter, it reached 4.6 to 1. These improvements cannot be attributed solely to the propeller modification, as American numerical superiority was increasing and German pilot quality was declining due to training limitations. However, combat reports make clear that improved climbing performance played significant roles in many of these victories. Thunderbolt pilots consistently reported catching German fighters in climbing engagements that would have been impossible months earlier, and German after-action reports consistently noted that American fighters were now contesting vertical combat effectively. The fear German pilots felt toward the Thunderbolt was amplified by their growing awareness that the technological and industrial trends were irreversible. Germany had no realistic prospect of developing and deploying countermeasures that would restore the tactical balance. German aircraft designers worked on advanced fighters like the Tu-152 and various jet fighter projects, but these were years away from meaningful production even under optimum conditions, and conditions in Germany during 1944 were anything but optimum. Allied bombing was disrupting production, fuel shortages were limiting training and operations, and the transportation network was collapsing under constant air attack. Meanwhile, American industry continued improving the Thunderbolt. Water methanol injection systems were introduced, boosting engine power to 2,535 horsepower for short periods. Combined with paddle blade propellers, this further enhanced performance. The P-47M variant, introduced in late 1944, incorporated both modifications and could climb as rapidly as any German fighter, while retaining all the other advantages that made Thunderbolts so formidable. German pilots were fighting an enemy that kept getting stronger, while their own capabilities stagnated or declined. This created a psychological burden that went beyond fear of any individual aircraft. It was the realization that they were fighting a losing battle against an enemy with unlimited resources, and the industrial capacity to continuously improve their weapons while Germany could not. Lieutenant Heinz Nock, who flew with Jagdgeschwader 11 and survived the war, kept a detailed diary that provides insight into the evolving German perspective on the Thunderbolt. Early entries from spring 1943 describe the P-47 as dangerous but manageable, an aircraft that could be engaged using standard tactics with reasonable prospects of success. Entries from summer 1944 reveal a completely different attitude. Nock describes Thunderbolts as relentless and nearly impossible to escape once they achieved firing position. He notes that squadron tactics had evolved to emphasize avoiding engagement with Thunderbolts unless holding overwhelming advantages, and even then, combat should be broken off at the first sign of difficulty. By fall 1944, Nock's entries reflect pure survival mentality. The goal was no longer to win air superiority, or even to inflict significant losses on the enemy. The goal was simply to survive each mission, to get airborne, make a single attack pass against the bombers, then escape before the escorts could respond. This was what the Thunderbolt and other Allied fighters had reduced the Luftwaffe to: desperate survival rather than effective military operations. The human dimension of this fear deserves recognition. German fighter pilots were young men, typically in their late teens or early 20s, fighting for their country under conditions of increasing hopelessness. They knew the war was likely lost by mid-1944, yet they continued flying because their culture demanded it, because their comrades depended on them, and because the alternative was to abandon their nation in its hour of greatest need. They climbed into their Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs each morning, knowing that American Thunderbolts and other fighters would be waiting, knowing that their aircraft were increasingly outmatched, knowing that their training was inadequate, and knowing that replacement pilots arriving to fill gaps left by casualties were even less prepared than they had been. The courage required to continue flying under these circumstances was extraordinary, yet it was courage spent in a losing cause. The Thunderbolt, more than any other Allied fighter, came to symbolize the industrial and technological superiority that made German defeat inevitable. It was not the most glamorous Allied fighter. That distinction probably belonged to the Mustang or the Spitfire. It was not the highest performing in any single category, but it combined ruggedness, firepower, versatility, and by mid-1944, vertical performance that made it uniquely dangerous across the full spectrum of air combat operations. German post-war accounts consistently identify the improved P-47 as one of the most formidable opponents they faced. Major Günther Rahl, who survived with 275 victories, noted in interviews that experienced German pilots had to treat paddle-blade Thunderbolts with the same caution they accorded Mustangs, recognizing that the American fighter could match German performance in most combat situations and exceed it in firepower and durability. Colonel Johannes Steinhoff, another highly decorated Luftwaffe pilot, stated that the Thunderbolt represented everything that made fighting the Americans so difficult. They had better aircraft, better training, more fuel, more ammunition, and the industrial capacity to replace losses faster than Germany could inflict them. The Thunderbolt, in Steinhoff's assessment, was the physical embodiment of American material superiority. When you engaged a Thunderbolt, you were not just fighting an aircraft and pilot, you were fighting the entire American industrial system that had produced it, maintained it, armed it, fueled it, and would replace it immediately if you managed to shoot it down. This was what made the Thunderbolt truly fearsome, not any single characteristic, but the totality of what it represented and what it could do when flown by properly trained pilots operating within a system that supported them completely. The fear German pilots felt was rational, based on experience and evidence, and it grew stronger as the war progressed and the gap in capabilities widened. By 1945, encountering Thunderbolts was something Luftwaffe pilots dreaded, knowing their chances of surviving such encounters diminished with each passing month as their own forces grew weaker and the enemy grew stronger. The destruction of the Luftwaffe as an effective fighting force was not the result of any single battle or technological breakthrough, but rather the accumulated weight of countless engagements where Allied fighters, particularly Thunderbolts, systematically ground down German fighter strength faster than it could be regenerated. The Battle of the Bulge in December 1944 and January 1945 illustrated this dynamic with brutal clarity. When German ground forces launched their surprise offensive through the Ardennes forest, poor weather initially prevented effective Allied air operations. German commanders had timed the offensive specifically to exploit weather conditions that would ground Allied aircraft, knowing their ground forces had no chance of success under clear skies. For several days, German armour and infantry advanced with minimal interference from above, and for those brief days, German soldiers experienced what earlier years of the war had felt like when the Luftwaffe contested or controlled the skies. But weather conditions inevitably cleared on December 23rd, and when they did, the full weight of Allied air power descended on German forces with catastrophic results. Thunderbolt groups flew hundreds of sorties daily, attacking everything that moved. The 56th Fighter Group alone flew more than 120 sorties on December 24th, destroying dozens of German tanks, trucks, and artillery pieces. Other Thunderbolt groups conducted similar operations across the entire Ardennes front. The Luftwaffe attempted to interfere, launching Operation Bodenplatte on January 1, 1945, a massive strike against Allied airfields intended to destroy Allied aircraft on the ground and provide German ground forces some breathing room. The operation achieved tactical surprise and destroyed or damaged several hundred Allied aircraft, but the cost was devastating. The Luftwaffe lost more than 300 aircraft and, more critically, over 200 pilots killed or captured, including many experienced unit commanders and flight leaders who were irreplaceable. Within days, Allied aircraft production replaced the destroyed planes. German losses could not be replaced. By mid-January, the German offensive had collapsed, crushed as much by air attack as by ground combat, and the Luftwaffe was finished as an effective force in the West. Thunderbolts had played a central role in this outcome, conducting both ground attack missions that destroyed German vehicles and equipment and air superiority missions that prevented the Luftwaffe from interfering with Allied operations. The final months of the war in Europe saw Thunderbolt operations expand to support the Allied advance into Germany itself. As American and British forces crossed the Rhine and drove deep into German territory, Thunderbolts ranged ahead of advancing ground forces, attacking German units attempting to retreat or reposition, destroying bridges and rail junctions to prevent reinforcement, and maintaining air superiority over the battlefield. German fighter resistance by this point was sporadic and ineffective. The few Luftwaffe fighters that managed to get airborne were vastly outnumbered and usually destroyed quickly by Allied fighters that controlled the skies completely. The psychological impact on German ground forces of fighting without air cover while constantly subjected to air attack was devastating. German soldiers who had known the comforting presence of Luftwaffe fighters overhead during the early years of the war now fought with the knowledge that the sky belonged to the enemy and that American Thunderbolts could appear at any moment to rain destruction down upon them. This air supremacy contributed directly to the rapid collapse of German military resistance in the West during spring 1945. Units that might have fought effectively when properly supported instead disintegrated under constant air attack, and the retreat became a rout. The Thunderbolt's contribution to victory in Europe extended beyond direct combat effectiveness to influence pilot morale and confidence throughout the American fighter force. Pilots who flew Thunderbolts knew they were operating aircraft that could bring them home even when badly damaged. This knowledge allowed them to press attacks more aggressively than they might have in more fragile fighters. When you know your aircraft can absorb battle damage and continue flying, you are more willing to close to short range where your firepower is most effective. When you know your aircraft can match enemy fighters in climbing performance, you are more willing to pursue into vertical engagements. This aggressive mentality, supported by aircraft capabilities that justified it, created a tactical culture within Thunderbolt squadrons that emphasized offensive action and initiative. The 56th Fighter Group exemplified this culture. The group flew Thunderbolts exclusively throughout the entire war, despite opportunities to transition to Mustangs. When offered the chance to convert to P-51s in late 1944, Group Commander Colonel David Schilling declined, stating that his pilots believed the Thunderbolt's rugged construction, heavy armament, and improved performance made it superior for their operations. The group's combat record supported this assessment. The 56th claimed more aerial victories than any other American fighter group in Europe, destroying approximately 677 enemy aircraft while losing fewer than 128 Thunderbolts to all causes. This nearly 6-to-1 kill ratio demonstrated what well-trained pilots could achieve in capable aircraft when properly supported. German recognition of American air superiority, and specifically the Thunderbolt's role in achieving it, appeared in various official documents and personal accounts from the final year of the war. A Luftwaffe intelligence assessment from August 1944 noted that American fighter capabilities had improved dramatically since early 1943, with specific mention of the P-47's enhanced performance, making it one of the most dangerous Allied fighters. The report recommended that German pilots engage Thunderbolts only when holding significant altitude or speed advantages, and emphasized that attempting to escape through climbing maneuvers was no longer effective. Another assessment from November 1944 was even more pessimistic, stating that Allied air superiority was now so complete that German fighter operations were essentially defensive in nature, focused on survival rather than achieving tactical objectives. The report identified multiple factors contributing to this situation, including American numerical superiority, better pilot training, improved aircraft performance, and the degradation of German capabilities due to fuel shortages and production disruptions. The improved Thunderbolt was listed among the primary threats German pilots faced, noted for its combination of firepower, durability, and performance that made it dangerous in all combat situations. Personal accounts from German pilots provide additional insight into how the Thunderbolt was perceived. Johannes Wiese, who flew with WW2 77 and survived the war with 133 victories, described the Thunderbolt in post-war interviews as deceptively dangerous. It looked ungainly and heavy, he noted, which sometimes led inexperienced German pilots to underestimate it. But experienced pilots knew the Thunderbolt was exceptionally capable in the hands of a competent pilot. Wiese recalled an engagement in July 1944, where he attacked a formation of Thunderbolts from above, expecting to dive through, fire a burst, and climb away using his Bf 109's superior climb rate. Instead, the Thunderbolts matched his climb, and he found himself in a desperate vertical fight where his aircraft's theoretical advantages meant nothing because the American fighter could match his maneuvers. He escaped only by diving away at full throttle, using speed rather than climbing performance, and considered himself fortunate to survive. That engagement, Wiese stated, taught him to treat Thunderbolts with the same respect he gave to Mustangs, recognizing that the American fighter had evolved far beyond the limitations it showed when first introduced. The engineering and industrial effort required to transform the Thunderbolt from a capable but limited fighter into a truly formidable weapon system demonstrated American advantages that extended far beyond military aviation. The ability to identify a problem in combat, develop an engineering solution, manufacture components at scale, and deploy them globally within months reflected an industrial and organizational capacity that Germany simply could not match by mid-war. This capacity applied across every aspect of American military operations. When American forces needed better tanks, industry redesigned and produced them. When better artillery was required, it was developed and deployed. When logistical systems needed improvement, they were reorganized and enhanced. The Thunderbolt's transformation was one example among hundreds of how American industrial might translate it into military advantage. For Germany, facing this enemy, the experience was like fighting a rising tide. No matter how many battles German forces won tactically, the strategic situation continued, deteriorating because the enemy could replace losses, improve capabilities, and deploy new resources faster than Germany could respond. The Thunderbolt stood as a symbol of this inexorable pressure, an aircraft that kept getting better while German fighters stagnated or declined in relative capability. The legacy of the P-47 Thunderbolt in military aviation history deserves greater recognition than it typically receives. Post-war narratives often emphasized the P-51 Mustang as the decisive American fighter of the European theater, focusing on its longer range and air-to-air performance. This emphasis is not without justification. The Mustang's ability to escort bombers to Berlin and beyond was strategically crucial, and its performance in air combat was exceptional. However, focusing exclusively on the Mustang obscures the Thunderbolt's massive contribution to Allied victory. Thunderbolts flew more combat sorties than any other American fighter type in Europe. They destroyed more ground targets than any other fighter. They achieved kill ratios comparable to or better than the Mustang. Most importantly, the Thunderbolt's transformation from limited performer to dominant fighter occurred at a crucial moment when German fighter forces still represented a formidable threat. The improvements that made this transformation possible, particularly the paddle blade propeller modification, came online in early 1944, just as the American strategic bombing campaign was reaching maximum intensity and desperately needed effective escort fighters. The Thunderbolt provided that capability precisely when it was most needed. Military historians analyzing the air war over Europe have sometimes minimized the Thunderbolt's importance by noting that it was eventually supplemented by Mustangs in the long-range escort role. This analysis misses the critical point that military effectiveness is not solely about maximum performance in any single category, but about delivering required capabilities when and where they are needed. The Thunderbolt delivered those capabilities consistently throughout the crucial period, from early 1944 through the end of the war. It escorted bombers deep into Germany, engaged and defeated German fighters, conducted devastating ground attack missions, and survived battle damage that would have destroyed more lightly built aircraft. No other Allied fighter matched this versatility. The Thunderbolt could do everything reasonably well, and some things better than any contemporary aircraft. This made it invaluable to American tactical commanders who needed fighters capable of multiple missions. A Thunderbolt group could fly bomber escort in the morning, fighter sweep at midday, and ground attack in the afternoon, using the same aircraft for all three missions. This operational flexibility multiplied American combat power and forced German defenders to prepare for multiple threat types from a single aircraft platform. The human stories of Thunderbolt pilots who made the aircraft feared by German forces deserve to be preserved and remembered. These were young men, mostly in their early 20s, who learned to fly heavy, powerful fighters and used them to achieve air superiority over Europe. Major Robert Johnson, who flew with the 56th Fighter Group, exemplified the determination and skill that made Thunderbolt pilots so effective. Johnson survived being shot down once and nursed badly damaged aircraft home on multiple occasions. He developed techniques for using the Thunderbolt's strengths to maximum advantage, particularly its diving speed and firepower. Johnson would position at altitude, dive on German formations at speeds exceeding 450 miles per hour, fire devastating bursts from his .850 caliber guns, then zoom back to altitude using speed and momentum. German fighters that attempted to follow his diving attacks found themselves unable to match the Thunderbolt's acceleration in the dive, and Johnson would be back at altitude before they could respond. He claimed 27 aerial victories using these tactics, and his example inspired other pilots to develop similar aggressive techniques that exploited the Thunderbolt's capabilities. Captain Walker Mahurin, another 56th Fighter Group pilot, demonstrated different but equally effective methods. Mahurin was a patient stalker who would position his Thunderbolt carefully, wait for the optimal firing opportunity, then strike with overwhelming firepower. He claimed 20 aerial victories in Thunderbolts before being shot down over France in March 1944 and evading back to Allied lines with help from the French resistance. After returning to combat, he continued flying Thunderbolts and adding to his victory total. Mahurin later stated that the Thunderbolt was the finest fighter aircraft he flew during the war, superior in his opinion to the Mustang because of its ruggedness and firepower. A fighter that could absorb damage and still bring you home was worth more than theoretical performance advantages that disappeared when your aircraft took hits, he argued, and his survival after multiple combat encounters where his Thunderbolt absorbed significant damage proved his point. The fear that German pilots felt toward the Thunderbolt was ultimately justified by evidence and experience. The aircraft that had seemed like a marginal fighter in early 1943 had evolved by mid-1944 into one of the most capable and dangerous fighters in the world. It combined speed, firepower, durability, and by that point, climbing performance that allowed it to compete with German fighters in virtually any tactical situation. More importantly, it was operated by increasingly skilled pilots who understood how to use its capabilities effectively, supported by an industrial system that kept improving the aircraft and replacing losses faster than the enemy could inflict them. For German pilots, already outnumbered and increasingly outmatched, the improved Thunderbolt represented a threat they had limited ability to counter. Standard tactics that had worked in 1943 no longer worked in 1944. Advantages they had counted on had been neutralized through American engineering and industrial effort. The psychological burden of facing improved Thunderbolts while flying aircraft that were not, improving while watching comrades die and replacements arrive with inadequate training while knowing the strategic situation was hopeless, was immense. Yet German pilots continued fighting because duty and honor demanded it, and many died in the process, shot down by Thunderbolts they had once believed they could evade. The story of why German pilots feared the Thunderbolt more than other Allied fighters is ultimately a story about the nature of industrial warfare and the advantages that accrue to nations capable of continuous improvement at scale. It is a story about how incremental enhancements, applied systematically across thousands of aircraft, can transform tactical and strategic balance more effectively than revolutionary new designs that exist primarily on paper. It is a story about the courage of pilots on both sides, Americans who flew heavy fighters deep into enemy territory and pressed attacks against determined opposition, and Germans who continued fighting under impossible conditions because surrender was not in their nature. The Thunderbolt earned its fearsome reputation through combat performance that evolved from marginal to dominant over the course of 18 months, and that transformation reflected the broader pattern of American military success in World War II. Identify problems, develop solutions, implement them faster than the enemy can respond, and accumulate advantages until victory becomes inevitable. For the young German pilots who faced improved Thunderbolts in the skies over Europe during 1944 and 1945, this pattern was not abstract historical analysis, but lived reality that cost many of them their lives. The fear they felt was recognition that they were fighting an enemy who would not stop improving, would not run out of resources, and would not accept anything less than total victory. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.